I get people. Okay, so we're gonna look at the front page. That's your notes page. We're gonna start out really basic here and hopefully help you understand what we're doing. So we've been dealing with our quadratic unit, parabolas, the U shapes, the smiley faces or frowny faces. Once again, dealing with quadratic. Smiley faces or frowny faces. So recall when solving, this is on your paper, you can probably read it better on there. So recall when solving a quadratic, you are finding the x-intercepts or the place where your parabola is crossing the x-axis, right? So remember when we solve it, that's what we're finding is where it crosses the x-axis. And we can find these values easily when you have a quadratic that is factorable. So remember, 2 units ago, we tested on how to factor a quadratic, right? We factor it out to its linear factor. So if we have this would be considered factored form. So let's say the original parabola was this. I'm going to tell you what it was originally. We started out here, so maybe just make some notes on the side. If we started out with this quadratic and we went through the process of factoring it, a times c adds up to b, does that recall, does that sound familiar? And then we drop and break. Does everybody know what I'm kind of talking about? And then we would get it down to this, right? Factoring. When we solve by factoring, don't we set each of those equal to 0 and solve? X minus 2 equals 0, and x plus 1 equals 0. That's solving by factoring. So we would add 2, so we get x is equal to 2, correct? And we would subtract 1 on this one, so we get negative 1. So this is solving by factoring. So we're finding, guys, if we were to graph this parabola when we solve the quadratic, we're finding that it's crossing at, we solved it, it's crossing at positive 2 and negative 1. So what I'm trying to make you understand is that when you solve a quadratic, once again, you're finding the x-intercepts. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. So now understand, though, there are quadratics. So this quadratic was factorable. So look at the next bulletin point on there. There are times when your quadratic will not be able to be factored. That you still have to be able to solve it. So this was solving by factoring, this example. And there are times when your quadratic is not factorable. You have to still be able to solve it. And this is when you'll use the quadratic formula. So maybe underline that. If it's not factorable, that's when we use the quadratic formula. We would way rather solve a quadratic by factoring, but if it doesn't factor, we'll use the quadratic formula. So looking at this bulletin point, the quadratic formula allows us to find irrational. Now, irrational means cannot be written as a fraction. So irrational and imaginary solutions. And these solutions you will get when a quadratic is not factorable. So if it doesn't factor, then your solutions will be irrational or imaginary. So this is what an irrational solution looks like. I want you to take your calculator and type this in. 2 plus the square root of 3. So let's all pull up our calculators. So let's all type this in, just so I want you to see what I'm talking about here. So type in 2 plus the square root of 3. Here we go. So 2 plus, you should all be typing it in. Now to do the square root, you'll go second square root of 3. Close your parentheses. Is everybody good up to here? If you hit enter, you get a decimal. That's considered irrational. Now here's why it's irrational. That decimal cannot be written as a fraction. So let me show you in your calculator how to try to see if this goes into a fraction. Because your calculator will give you this in fraction mode if it can be written as a fraction. So let's all hit the math key right here. Math. Now notice it says fraction. So we're going to hit enter. So we want it to be a fraction. Now we hit enter again. And you see how it just gave us a decimal again? That's because it cannot be written as a fraction. So this decimal is irrational, cannot be written as a fraction. So we could still graph that roughly, right? Go over 3, roughly 0.7 units, and that's where it crosses the x-axis. So an irrational solution still crosses the x-axis, but it's not in a pretty place. Okay. And then imaginary solutions, guys, will look like this. So maybe write that down on your paper. It'll have this form. A plus bi, so 2i, the I part's what makes it imaginary. So the I part is what makes it imaginary, and those solutions will never cross the x-axis. So I'm going to draw a blue parabola here. This would be an example of a parabola that has imaginary solutions. You see how it never crosses the x-axis? That's when you have imaginary solutions. So this would also have imaginary solutions because it never crosses the x-axis. So we would have to solve that by the quadratic formula. Now understand the quadratic formula always works. You can always use the quadratic formula to solve any type of polynomial. So even if it is factorable, even if your quadratic can be factored, you could still use the quadratic formula. The reason we don't is really the quadratic formula is probably the hardest for people to actually get right, just because there's lots of room for error. Okay, so next thing here is how to solve using the quadratic formula. So these are the sets. To solve using the quadratic formula, we need to make sure our quadratic is in standard form and set equal to 0. ax squared plus bx plus c. It needs to be in that order, and most importantly, it needs to be set equal to 0. Once you have that in order, then you're going to determine what a, b, and c is. Remember, a is what's in front of x squared. So you'll say a is this. You'll look in front of x, that's your b, and then you'll look at your constant, and you'll list out what c is. And then you're going to go through and do the quadratic formula. From here, it's just literally plugging it in. This is the quadratic formula. So it's x equals negative b. Everybody follow through so you know what I'm talking about. Plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c. And that's all over 2a. Now that's a way to solve any type of quadratic no matter what. You can find the solutions using that formula. So as you can see, we're literally just going to take A and plug it in. Take C, plug it in, B, and plug it in, and then we've got to simplify it correctly. So it's not super a hard idea, but it's just the simplifying that makes it hard. Yeah. Yep, always minus 4 times A times C, always. Yep, good question. I'm going to just, a lot of people will teach this, and I'm going to do it even though there's only a few of you. It's like more embarrassing to like do this dumb little thing in front of a small group, which is weird. But like a lot of people will teach this with a like little song to pop was illegal. So they will. It's like this song, which helps people memorize it. So I'm just gonna sing it to you real quick. Don't expect anything great because I'm not like this one. But it's just like this. See, they go like this. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a, and that helps them memorize it. Yes. Logan had my class in secondary 2 a couple years ago. He still remembers that. But really, guys, because if you have that memorized, it sucks to just memorize it. So I'll sing it one more time, and then you can kind of sing it in your head. I won't make you guys sing it, but I usually make my classes sing it, but there's so many little of you that you probably don't want. So I'm going to sing it again. Here we go. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a, and it just really helps. Now, from there, it's easy to plug it in, but the hard thing is simplifying it correctly. So note, the hardest part about the quadratic formula is simplifying this piece correctly. So I want you to highlight, this is the hardest piece to simplify. Now, what we're going to want to do is only simplify in our calculator. This is the thing you've got to remember. In your calculator, you only type in what's underneath the square root. You only type in that part. So you don't type in the square root part into your calculator, only that part. Now here's why. If you type in the square root part in your calculator, then it's going to give you a decimal or it's going to give you an error, because the whole reason we're having to use the quadratic formula is because the square root doesn't come out pretty. It's going to come out not very pretty, and we have to do it by hand. Okay. And then third, make sure your answer is in the simplified form. So really the best way to understand this is just to start practicing it. So here we go. Before we do that, once again, because I said the hardest part is simplifying what's underneath the square root, let's go back and remember how to simplify some things under the square root. Really, guys, these are the most missed problems only because people can't simplify correctly. So we did go over this at the beginning of the year, so let's re-practice it again, because this is the hardest part of the quadratic formula. So look at number 1. If I said to you, simplify the square root of 4. So what we would do is break it down into its factors. Factors mean what multiply to be 4. So 4 is 2 times 2, correct? So then because it's a square root, we're pulling out groups of 2. Right, everybody? If you can't do this, you cannot do the quadratic formula. Okay, so we're pulling out a 2. So can't we pull out you have to pull out groups of 2, and then only one of them leaves the house, right? I mean, they both leave the house, sorry, but it's only one of them. Do you get what I'm saying? So we're going to pull out a 2 for those two 2's because they leave in groups of 2. The buddy system. Does everybody understand? So was there anything left under the root in this problem? No. So the square root of 4 is 2. Does everybody understand? This is our answer. Okay, what's the square root of 12? So you'd say to yourself, I got to break this down by hand. So 12 breaks down into 4 times 3. Now 4 continues to break down into 2 times 2. Now remember not to double dip. That's what people tend to do in secondary math too. Isn't 4 not there anymore? We rewrote it as 2 times 2. So cross that out and cross out the 12. So what we have is 2 times 2 times 3. Now we're pulling out groups of 2. If there's 2 of them, they can leave the house. So we're going to pull out a 2. They come in the buddy system. So we're only pulling out a 2 for those two 2's. Now 3 cannot come out because there's only one of him. Does everybody understand? So let's underneath the house, because we weren't able to leave the house, was the square root of 3. So it's left under the house. Does everybody understand? That's literally the hardest part of the quadratic formula. You can do this, then you can do quadratic formula easy. Everybody pretty good with that. Okay, let's do 8. 4 times 2, 4 breaks down into 2 times 2. Once again, I strongly suggest you crossing out things that you've rewritten so you don't double dip. So what will this simplify to be? 2. Good. We'll pull out a 2. The buddy system, most can leave. That's got to stay because there's only 1. 2 square roots of 2. Good. Everybody good with that? Okay, we're going to have bigger things like 300. So you would, if you need to, you could take your calculator and divide it by 2, but I'm going to do something bigger. I know that that's 30 times 10. But even if you did 2, you just keep breaking it down. Now 30 breaks down into 5 times 6. 6 breaks down into 3 times 2, correct? 10 breaks down into 5 times 2. Now with something like this, you guys have to go in and cross out what you might double dip on or you're going to double dip. So do you see how 6 is not there anymore? We rewrote 6 as 3 times 2, right? So cross out 6. Do you see how 30 is not there anymore? We rewrote 30 as 5 and 6. And then 10 is not there anymore. You rewrote it as 5 times 2. And obviously 300 is not there. So now we're pulling out groups of 2. If there's 2 of them underneath the house, they can leave. So isn't there 2 5s that can leave the house? We'll pull out a 5. Now let's see, don't we have 2 2's that can leave the house? So we're going to pull out a 2. And then left underneath is that 3, because there's not another 3 to pull out. So we have that square root of 3. Is everybody good with that? So then you multiply what you pull out, multiply anything left underneath. So 5 times 2 is 10. So this would be 10 square roots of 3. So once again, if you can do this correctly, then you can usually do the quadratic formula correctly. Okay, let's do a couple more. Now remember back to, I just want to remind you of something, then I'll erase this. The square root of -1 is I, correct? That's where these imaginary solutions start coming in. If you have a negative under a square root, -1, then you're going to have an I, an imaginary. So you'll always pull out the negative, and it will be I on the outside. So let's simplify these. 25. Notice there's a negative. So what I want you to think of this as is actually the square root of -1 times 25. So 25 breaks down into 5 times 5. Now we're pulling out groups of 2, correct? So we'll pull out a 5, and then we pull out an I. So then left underneath the house is nothing. So this is our answer, 5I. So this would be considered an imaginary solution when we do it in the quadratic formula. So let's do this one, the square root of -48. Think of it as -1 times 48. So break down 48. 8 times 6, 8 breaks down into 4 times 2. And 6 breaks down into 2 times 3. 4 breaks down into 2 times 2. Let's not double dip. So let's cross out some things here. 8's not there because you rewrote it as 4 times 2. 6 is not there because you rewrote it as 2 and 3. 4 is not there because you rewrote it as 2 and 2. Correct, everybody? Is anybody lost? Okay. Pulling out groups of 2. So we'll pull out a 2. We'll pull out a 2. and left is a 3. And we'll pull out an I, correct? So we pulled out a 2, an I, and left was a 3. So that would be 4I square roots of 3. Is everybody good with that? Okay, so you guys try 7 and 8 real quick. Okay, so tell me what you did. 7 times 7, and then you pulled out a 7, and you pulled out a I, 7I. Were you all able to get to that? Okay, 360, what factors did you do? Just curious. Okay, 72 and 5, that's great. And then you did 24 and 3, okay, I like it. 24 and 3, and then oh, 8 and 3. Oh, 8 and 3, got it. Yep, and then 8 is 4 and 2, and then 4 is 2 and 2. Okay, so now we would make sure we don't double dip. 4 we rewrote as 2 and 2, 8 as 4 and 2, 24 as those, and then that's 72 as well. So pulling out groups of 2, right? We'll pull out a 2 and a 3 and an I. I saw you guys remember that. Way to go. And then left was a 2 and a 5. So we have this on the outside, a 2 and a 3 and an I. And then left under the house was a 2 and a 5. 2 times 5. So our final answer would be 6. 3 times 2 is 6. I square roots of 10. Everybody good with that? Okay, if you can do that, then you can do pretty much the quadratic formula. So let's start practicing. Here we go. You're going to want a whiteboard maybe, and I would do it on your paper so you can refer back to your notes if you can fit it. All right, so our first step with quadratic formula is to get it in standard form and set equal to 0. Ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. This one's in standard form. So now list out what a is. A is the variable in front of x squared, or in front of n squared, so a is 1. My b value is in front of x, so that's in positive 9. If you get this wrong, you get the whole quadratic formula wrong. And our c value is negative 136. You've got to put the signs in correctly. Does anybody have any questions? Please ask if you do. Okay, so then you should be saying to yourself, I am going to solve by quadratic formula. So x equals, I write it down every time so that I plug it in correctly. X equals negative b, rewrite it with me, plus or minus the square root. Now use parentheses right here, it's really important. B squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, so notice how I put parentheses. That's to help me not make any sign errors. When plugging it into your calculator, you have to use parentheses. So that's why I put them in when I write it. So let's plug it in. So x equals negative b, which really just is the opposite of b. Negative b is opposite of b. Isn't this positive 9? So we're putting in negative 9 because b is 9. Then we have plus or minus. We're going to write a square root. B squared, we're going to show our work. So we have b is 9. We're putting in 9 squared. Does everybody see where I'm plugging this in? Minus 4, then times a. Look, what's my a value? 1. Times c, so use parentheses. What is c? Negative 136. Does everybody understand? That's all. Make sure you do this correctly. From here to here, all over 2 times a. And we look back and a was 1. So 2 times 1. Now this is where it's the hardest for people to get right. Usually they can get up to here, but this next part, the simplification just gets people. So what you're going to do is always rewrite it again. You're going to say x equals negative 9 plus or minus. Now always draw it in exactly like this. Put in the square root. And only type this piece into your calculator. You've got to use parentheses exactly as you see it. If you don't use parentheses, I promise you it will calculate it wrong. So let's all make sure I want every single person typing it in before we move on, because I want to help you make sure you get it right in your calculator. So everybody go parentheses. Like I should see you all typing. Okay, so we are going parentheses, 9 squared. I'm not typing in the square root part. And then minus 4 times a, so 4 times 1 times negative what? 136. Does everybody see how I typed it in? You start getting lazy with typing that in, you start getting it wrong. We get 625. Is everybody good? So then you go to your thing and put in your you put in your 625. That's all over 2 times 1, which is 2. Now understand something. You would never ever, even if this was, let's pretend this would have been let's say this would have been a 4 right here. You see how 4 and 2 could divide? You will never, ever, ever, ever divide those two things alone. The only time we can simplify is if all 3 of these things divide by something in common. So what I'm saying is, right here, never divide these two diagonally right now. Is everybody good with that? So then from this step, we go off to the side and we simplify this part. So now we're just going to focus on this and we're going to do it by hand. Now I'm okay at this point if you type it into, well, let's just do it by hand. So 625, we've got to do it by hand because if it's a decimal, we'll have to do it by hand anyways. So 625, divide it by like 25 for me, somebody. Okay, so we have 25 times 25. 25 breaks down into 5 and 5. 25 breaks down into 5 and 5. We're pulling out groups of, so 25 isn't there anymore. So we're pulling out groups of 2. So when we pull out a 5 and a 5, and then left underneath is nothing. So the radical went away. Does everybody understand? This became, that can't be. Yeah, 5 times 5. 5 times 5, which is 25, right? We're making sure we multiply. Does everybody understand? So we now just simplified this to be 25 with no radical left because there was nothing left underneath the root. So rewrite it again. We have x is equal to negative 9 plus or minus, not square root of 25. We did the square root. This one's just 25 all over 2. Everybody understand? So now you would split apart your answer because this is technically 2 answers here, the plus and minus. You would say, okay, x is equal to, this is negative 9 plus 25 all over 2. And we have x is equal to negative 9 minus 25 all over 2. Does everybody understand? So then you would look and say, can I add that top thing together? Negative 9 plus 25. Yeah, we can add those together. What is on top? Negative 16, right? So really this one is negative 16 over 2. Which, what is that? What's negative 16 divided by 2? Negative 8. So there's one of our solutions. Now I want you to calculate this in your calculator. Calculate the top here. Negative 9 minus 25. Negative, okay, negative 34 all over 2. So take your calculator and do that. What's negative 34 divided by 2? Negative 16, you said. Right. Negative 17. Okay, there we go. And there's our other answer. So do you guys get it? I mean, for the most part, it's just, but you can see where there's a lot of room for error. Oh, it should be positive 16, right? This should have been positive 16. And then this would be positive 8. Good. Good fix, Logan. Is everybody good with that? Okay. Okay, so let's do you want to do another one, or are you ready to practice something like that? One more, another one, one more. Okay, here we go. Number 2, so we have this quadratic that's in standard form. So my A value is 2. Careful here, B value is negative 1, right? And my C value is negative 66. So I'm going to solve quadratic formula. So x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Let's plug it in. Here we go. This one will go faster. X equals the opposite of b. Careful here. Isn't b negative 1? So it's going to be positive 1. Opposite of negative 1 is positive 1. Plus or minus the square root. We've got to use parentheses, b squared. So negative 1, because that's b, squared minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is negative 66. And that's all over 2 times a, which is 2. Okay, so we would always rewrite this. So we have x is equal to 1 plus or minus, right in the square root part, because we know we're not going to type that into our calculator, and only type that into your calculator exactly as you see it. So tell me what we get. You've got to use parentheses exactly as you see it. Okay, does everybody get that? Okay, you got 529? Did you use parentheses when typing it in?
I think it's negative.
Oh, okay, that'll make sense. So you guys got 529, very good. And that's all over 2 times 2 is 4. Is everybody good? So then this is always the step where we go off to the side and say, I'm going to simplify 529, the hardest part of the quadratic formula. So give me some factors of that. Try dividing by 2. If that doesn't work, divide by 3. Keep going. Find some. Okay, perfect. 23 and 23. Okay, now 23 doesn't keep breaking down, but isn't there 2 23s? So we'll pull out a 23. So we pulled out a 23, there was nothing left under the root. So the square root went away, we pulled out 23. All right, so we have x is equal to 1 plus or minus 23 all over 4. So then we would say, I know that looking at that, I can add 1 and 23, so I better split this up. We have x is equal to 1 plus 23 over 4, and we have x is equal to 1 minus 23 all over 4. Then we would simplify that. So on top here, we have x is equal to 1 plus 23 is 24, right? So we have 24 divided by 4, which is 6. There's one of our answers. 1 minus 23 is negative 22 over 4. Now I want you all to take your calculator, do negative 22 divided by 4. What do you get? Okay, 5.5. Now I want the simplified fraction. So hit the math key on your calculator, math, and hit enter, enter. Negative 11 over 2. So we want the fractions. So there's our other solution. 1, 2. Is everybody good with that? You guys ready to practice some that look about like that on your worksheet? Okay, so I'm going to have you do, I'm going to skip, I'm going to change my mind because I feel like we need to let you practice here. So right now on the worksheet, you're going to do problem number 1 and 2. And then we'll move on to the ones where we get some imaginary solutions and irrational. Those ones should come out nice and pretty like the last 2 examples. So number 3, so once again, you'd list out A is 5, B is 2, and C is negative 19. So we know that x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, so here we go. X equals negative b. So opposite of b would be negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 2 squared. B squared is 2 squared minus 4 times a, which is 5, times c, which is negative 19. And that's all over 2 times a, so that'd be 2 times 5. So we have x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus the square root. Type that into your calculator and tell me what we get. Really quickly, the quicker we can get done. Oops. Positive 384, and that's all over 2 times 5, which is 10. So this is where we go off to the side. We break down 384. This one's a good one. So tell me some factors. You can See if you can find some. Any factors will work. 192 times 2? So 2 and 192. Good. Now take 192. Does that divide by 2? 2 times 96, and then 96, let's break that one down. Try dividing it by 2. That doesn't work with 1, 3. Okay, 2 and 48, and then 48 breaks down into, 8 and 6, correct? And then 8 breaks down, holy cow, 4 times 2. And then, why is my screen going crazy? I just can't fit it because I wrote so big. And then 4 breaks down into 2 times 2, and 6 breaks down into 2 times 3. Now go through and let's cross out so we don't accidentally double dip because there's a lot going on. So pull out a 2, pull out a 2, pull out a 2. Oh, we can't forget that 2 up there, right? Did I miss anything? Nope. So left underneath is a 2 and a 3. So we pulled out a 2, 2, 2. So we had a 2 times 2 times 2, and then left underneath the house was 2 and 3, right? So that would be 8 square roots of 6. Is everybody feeling good about that? So I'm going to rewrite, and we just simplified that to be 8 square roots of 6. So write it again. X is equal to negative 2 plus or minus. We just simplified that, 8 square roots of 6 all over 10. Is everybody good up to here? Now, we would split this apart because this is technically 2 answers here. So we have x is equal to negative 2 plus 8 square roots of 6 all over 10. And we also have x is equal to negative 2 minus 8 square roots of 6 all over 10. Now this is correct, but it's considered not simplified. There's one more thing we can simplify here. Do you see how this 2, this 8, and this 10 all divide by 2? This is when it would be appropriate, the only time to divide all 3 things by 2. So the only time you can divide something is if all of them divide. Now one more rule, you can never divide something underneath a radical with something that's not. So even though this 6 also divides by 2, we won't divide it with anything. Does everybody understand? So this divides by 2 and becomes a 1. This divides by 2 and becomes a 4. This divides by 2 and becomes a 5. So do you see how I divided 2 by every piece? So our answer is actually x is equal to negative 1 plus, this one's plus 4 square roots of 6 all over 5. This would be the most appropriate answer. And then the same thing down here. They all divide by 2, so this becomes a 1, a 4, and a 5. So we also have x is equal to negative 1 minus 4 square roots of, 4 square roots of 6 all over 5. There's our 2 solutions. All quadratics have 2 solutions. Everybody good with that one? Do I need to do, or do you feel like I am pretty good because I know how to simplify and everything with those kinds? Do you want one more with that, maybe? Or are you good? Completely up to you guys. You're feeling okay? Okay, so I'll tell you which ones to do now again. So go to your worksheet, and these are the ones you need to do. Number 4 and number 6. Right now, check those ones with me. Okay, last example, then the rest of the time is yours to finish. So my A value is 1, my B value is negative 6, my C value is 12. So x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. So we have x is equal to negative b, so positive 6, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so that'll be negative 6 squared minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is 12, and that's all over 2 times 1. So we have x is equal to 6 plus or minus the square root. Type that in really quick for me and tell me what it is. Negative 12. So we have negative 12 all over 2. Now, once again, do not do 6 divided by 2. You can only divide if all three things divide, and this is underneath the root. So right now, we cannot simplify. So, but we're going to go off. This is our place where we go off to the side and just focus on simplifying this correctly. Square root of negative 12. So that's 4 and 3, 2 and 2. And then when we pull out I as well, so we pull out a 2, I, and then left with a 3. 2i square roots of 3. Does everybody understand? So that was what that piece became. So we have x is equal to 6 plus or minus. That became 2i square roots of 3 all over 2. Now, what you would be able to do from here is say, you could split it up or you could simplify right here. Here's why. Do you see how all three things divide by 2? That's when it's okay. But once again, never divide something with underneath a radical with not. So 6, 2, and 2, don't they all divide by 2? So rewrite it like this. This divides by 2 and becomes a 1. This divides by 2 and becomes a 3. This piece divides by 2 and becomes a 1. Is everybody good with that? So we have x is equal to 3 plus or minus 1i. So isn't 1i just I? So I, and then we still had our square root of 3, and then that's all divided by 1. Isn't anything divided by 1 just itself? So I don't need to write the divided by 1. I wouldn't be wrong if I did, but I just am not going to. Now we could split that up because that's really x is equal to 3 plus I square roots of 3, and x is equal to positive 3 minus I square roots of 3. I think that's probably best to split them up as our final answer. So it's no different, same idea with the other things, it's just going to have an I in it if there's a negative underneath the square root. Okay, do you guys feel comfortable finishing maybe? Okay, so go ahead, I won't do any more, finish the worksheet up and at least finish the ones that are your practice. You don't have to do the teacher example ones. So that's just that one page, and then if you check those off with me, you can have it in.